Hello all, this is my second lecture in week 7. We're going to continue talking about other moves for civil rights. Okay, and we're going to talk about the Alcatraz takeover. Um, so it was from November 20th, 1969 to June 11th of 1971. The first occupation happened in 1964 and it lasted for approximately 4 hours. The early demands were for a cultural center on Alcatraz and an Indian university there. Um, it was occupied by Richard Mackenzie and 5 Sioux. On November 9th of 1969, Richard Oakes, a Mohawk Indian, um, went with Indian students and urban Indians, and they called it Indians of all tribes. Um, One thing that's often ignored in Native American history is that we group Native Americans together, but they don't necessarily see that joint history, um, even less so than maybe African Americans or other groups, because different tribes actually had different issues, different animosities, and we think of them as a cohesive movement, but they have not always thought of themselves as a cohesive movement. And that's one of the important ideas that comes out of this is that they share the same history, they share the same pain, and that it really unites them. And that kind of turns into the American Indian movement. It is consistently a red power movement. Unlike the civil rights movement, there's never kind of um, a more nonviolent, less radical section of it. Instead, it's always kind of radical and out there and willing to do self defense. So, 1968 is when they are formed. They're a big part of the occupation that takes place in the 19 months. They're formed by George Mitchell, Dennis Banks, and Clyde Bellecourt. So Richard Oakes meets with others and proposes a more sustained occupation after his occupation November 9th, that he feels like that's possible. About 100 people occupied the island. Initially, Richard Oakes was like the chief or the mayor. They thought of him in the leadership position. Um, the American, they elected a council, and everyone had jobs, in child care and sanitation, and the American government resisted at first, but eventually agreed to formal negotiations. Their early demands were very similar to the first occupation. They wanted a deed to the island, an Indian university and culture center and museum on the island. Okay, and this is, I included this. This is the Alcatraz Proclamation to the Great White Father and his people. So it's kind of a statement of their demands. I'm just going to read it over. We, the Native Americans, reclaim the land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of American Indians by right of discovery. We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land and hereby offer the following treaty. We will purchase that Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island about 300 years ago. We know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than was paid for when Manhattan Island was sold, but we know that land values have risen over the years. Our offer of $1.24 per acre is greater than the 47 cents per acre that the white men are now paying the California Indians for their land. We will give to the inhabitants of this island a portion of that land for their own, to be held in trust by the American Indian Affairs and by the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs in order to perpetuity. For as long as the sun shall rise and the rivers shall go down the sea, we will further guide the inhabitants in the proper way of living. We will offer them our religion, our education, our life ways, in order to help them achieve our level of civilization and thus raise them and their all-white brothers up from the savage, unhappy state, we offer this treaty in good faith and wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the white man. We feel that the so-called Alcatraz Island is more than suitable as an Indian reservation, as determined by the white man's own standards. By this we mean that this place resembles most Indian reservations in that 1. It is isolated from modern facilities without adequate means of transportation. 2. It has no fresh running water. 3. It has inadequate sanitation facilities. 4. There are no oil or mineral rights. 5. There is no industry, and so unemployment is very great. 6. There is no health care facilities. 7. The soil is rocky and non-productive, and the land does not support game. 8. There are no educational facilities. 9. The population has always exceeded the land base. 10. The population has always been held as prisoners and kept dependent on others. Further, it would be fitting and symbolic that ships from all over the world entering the Golden Gate would first see Indian land and thus be reminded of the true history of this nation. This tiny island would be a symbol of the great lands once ruled by the free and noble Indians. So I think you can see a lot of important themes of Native American history as you look at this Alcatraz Proclamation and some of the injustices that they feel they had suffered. So eventually two groups kind of rose in opposition to Richard Oakes. Many of the original group were students from UCLA, and they returned to college, and many of the people that moved to Alcatraz to replace them didn't have the same vision. Also, there was a big move-in from the counterculture movement, and a lot of non-Indians who really did not understand what was going on, and drugs also become a problem. So January 5th, 1970, Yvonne Oakes' 13-year-old stepdaughter fell 3 floors to her death. Oakes after that leaves the islands, and the two groups kind of compete for leadership. The government shuts off all electrical power and removes the water barge, which had provided fresh water to the occupiers. 3 days following the removal of the water barge, a fire broke out on the island. Several historic buildings were also destroyed. The government blamed the Indians. The Indians blamed the undercover government infiltrators trying to turn non-Indian supporters against them. Eventually, 2 oil tankers collided, and while it could not specifically be blamed on the lack of power at Alcatraz, it really inspired Nixon to move on Alcatraz. June 10th of 1971, armed federal marshals, FBI agents, and Special Forces police swarmed the island and removed 5 women, 4 children, and 6 unarmed Indian men. And with that, the occupation was pretty much officially over. So clearly they never got what they asked for from the American government, and they didn't even really get much negotiation. But there are some positive, important effects from the Native American occupation of Alcatraz. One is public awareness. People often think of Native Americans, and I know this from teaching American history, people often think of them as an extinct people. And that's not a fact even today in 2016. You're still talking about a people with their own history, their own awareness, and their own struggle. And that was one thing that Alcatraz brought. In the beginning, up until Oakes leaves and it kind of disintegrates, the media presentation of Alcatraz is very positive. That what they really want is not completely unreasonable. President Nixon, during this time, returned Blue Lake and 48,000 acres of land to the Taos Indians. Occupied lands near Davis, California, would become home to a Native American university. In addition, with other movements, it led to inspiring Native Americans to work the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And that's important for a couple reasons. One, Native Americans often experience the highest rate of unemployment especially those who live on reservations. And the idea that the federal government had not hired Native Americans to work in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which specifically was designed to deal with Native American issues, is just kind of astounding. Um, so there's another major kind of event in the AIM movement or the Red Power movement, and that's the 1973 Wounded Knee. Um, so it's a 71-day siege, and it takes place in February of 1973. There's 200 Oglala, Lakota, Sioux activists and members of AIM seized control of Wounded Knee, South Dakota. They took the town and its citizens hostage. They demanded the American government make good on treaties for the Native Americans for the last 19th and 20th centuries. Some historians and Native Americans claim there actually were no hostages. This was on the, sorry, I left a word out there. This was on the Pine Ridge Reservation. This city was. Some claimed that there were white people at the post office and that they did, but this was a source of a lot of hostility for Native Americans. The U.S. Marshal Service, FBI, and National Guard seized the town after they cut the electricity and the water. The first casualty was actually when they opened fire on a Native American activist retrieving supplies from a supply drop. So around day 50, a gentleman who was sympathetic to the cause had done a supply drop from the air, and a Native American activist went out to get the packages and was hit and killed by the federal services. Overall, there were 2 Native American activists killed, and a federal agent was shot and paralyzed. It reminded many of the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, where the U.S. cavalry killed a group of Lakota warriors who refused to disarm. And clearly, part of the reason they picked it was symbolic. So, conclusion, this was, Native American activism started earlier. We have already talked about the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, where there was a lot of debate still whether that was about giving civil rights or about more Native American assimilation, which is something that Native Americans have faced pretty much since the original settlers came. It was usually more radical and straight to red power ideas, rather than having some kind of more, mainstream movement. I don't necessarily like that term, but it was more radical, and they were calling for serious changes. So this is my reference slide for this week on Alcatraz and Wounded Knee. Hope you guys will check out some of my sources. Thanks and have a great day.